Okay, so we have just wrapped up our section on prototyping our game in Unreal Engine. So now we are going to switch gears a little bit and start talking about asset creation in Blender. Now, Blender is a free open source 3D modeling toolkit that is comparable to other commercial standards such as Maya and 3ds Max. Now, you may be asking yourself, why do we even need to use Blender? Well, although Unreal Engine has some modeling toolkits and features which we use to create our prototype mesh pieces, these features are experimental and still under development. So it is better to use a dedicated program to create our art assets that we will eventually be using to replace those prototype meshes. So in this video, I'm just going to talk about how to download and install Blender for those of you who have not done so already. So if you already have Blender installed on your machine, you can go ahead and skip this video. For those of you who have not downloaded it, all you have to do is open up your web browser and navigate to blender.org. You'll get a page, you'll get this page or one similar to it. Now, at the time of this recording, 3.2.1 is the version of Blender that is most recent, but you can use any version of Blender after 3.0 should work just fine and have all the same functionalities. So go ahead and navigate to the blender.org homepage, and whatever version of Blender that is most recent, just go ahead and download that one and everything should still work out the same. If you have any problems with like the interface being changed around, obviously I don't know in the future what their plans are for changing it, but we are going to be using 3.2. So from the blender.org homepage, we're just going to go ahead and hit download Blender. Now it should bring you to this page here, the /download page. If you are working on a Mac, I believe it will detect that automatically and your button here will be for Mac. But if for whatever reason it doesn't, you can download other versions, older versions, Mac versions, and Linux if you're using it. I'm, however, going to be demonstrating all of this on a Windows machine. So I'm just going to go ahead and click the download Blender 3.2.1 for Windows. All right, your download should start automatically, and you'll get this page and you can read a little bit about Blender if you're interested, but we're just going to go ahead and run the MSI by opening it. So we're going to get these Blender setup wizard. Everything here we're just basically going to keep at the default. We have the EULA here, go ahead and accept it. Again, Blender is completely free and open source, so anything you create in Blender, you can publish and sell commercially, so don't worry about that. It'll ask you where you want it. We're just going to leave it at the default location. Hit next, and then we're just going to press install. Once your installation is complete, go ahead and click Finish. And from here, we should now be able to open Blender. Okay, so when you first start up Blender for the first time, you will be met with this splash screen. This is your quick setup here, and it's just gonna ask you some initial settings that you want for how you want to configure Blender. So we're going to leave almost all of these default. Obviously our language is going to be English. Our shortcuts we are going to leave on Blender. Now if you are coming from an older version or Maya or something like that, there's ways for you to change the shortcuts, but we're going to leave them on Blender, and all of the hotkeys and shortcuts I'm going to be discussing in this course will be based on the Blender settings. So leave this at Blender unless you know all the conversions. We're going to select with our left mouse button, and the only thing we're really going to change is this spacebar functionality. This is just asking what function do you want to be bound to the spacebar key. By default it is play, meaning play your animations if you are creating any in Blender. Now, we're not going to be making any animations in Blender. We are just going to be modeling our art assets. So I want to change this to search. This I find is much more useful than having play on the spacebar function, because Blender has a lot of functionalities, a lot of different operations you can use, and sometimes you just don't know what menu they're located under, so it's easier to just hit the spacebar and type in the function you want and find it that way. So put the spacebar function on search. Theme, this is purely cosmetic, whatever you prefer here. I'm just going to leave it at the default Blender dark. These settings can always be changed at a later date as well. So I'm going to hit save, and that will change the splash screen to this one. Now, every time you open Blender after the initial setup, you'll get this splash screen right here. Now, normally on this side, you will have any recent projects that have been opened in Blender. I currently do not have any projects that have been opened with Blender 3.2, so it just has some links, some external links here for like a manual and the website and release notes and things of that nature. But normally any files that you have recently worked on will be on this right side right here. And on the left side right here is how you generate your new file based on any of these templates right here. So you can go ahead and explore these on your own time, but we are always going to be using the general template here. So you can either click here to open a new general file, or you can just click off the splash screen itself, because by default it will load a empty new general file when you open Blender. So before we actually jump in and look at the interface and navigation and things like that, there are just a couple of settings that I want to take care of up front. So let's go ahead and go to the Edit Preferences window and pull this one up right here. Now, Blender is highly configurable, so you can spend many hours looking at all the different things you can change within the preferences, but I just want to highlight a couple of really key things that will affect your usage of Blender depending on your machine setup. So the first thing I want to look at, let's look at this side tab right here and come into Input. So there's a couple of options we have for our keyboard and our mouse. So Blender uses a lot of keyboard shortcuts, so some of those functions are bound to the numpad, which is the collection of number keys you have on the far right side of your keyboard. However, not all keyboards have a numpad. For instance, my keyboard does not have one. So in order to still be able to access those functions, I need to click up here where it says Emulate Numpad. So what this is doing basically is all those functions that were bound to the numpad keys, when I click this, they will automatically be bound to the same numbers on the top row of my keyboard. So if you do not have a numpad, make sure you emulate a numpad here. Additionally, if you do not have a 3-button mouse, you can emulate it here. The navigation around the 3D viewport in Blender really hinges on being able to use that middle mouse button. So if you are on a laptop or something like that, it's really important that you select this here. I'm going to leave this unchecked because I have a 3-button mouse. Additionally, any keybinds that you wish to change can be done by coming down to Key Map. Now you can search it by the name of the function itself if you know it, or if you want to search keybind, you can search that up here. So I'm going to leave everything default just to not make things too confusing for you. But just know that if you have any need to rebind any of these keys, you can do so here. And additionally, we see that these are some of the settings that we set up in the quick setup screen right here, such as the spacebar action, we have it to search. If you decided that you did in fact want it on play, you could set that here as well. All right, so that is all I really wanted to discuss for the initial settings here and these preferences, but go ahead and look these over at your leisure if you care to configure Blender more specifically to your needs. But I'm going to leave most everything at default. All I have changed is that I have selected Emulate Numpad here, so I can use it with the keyboard that I have. All right, so that is it for settings and preferences. We're gonna come back in the next video and do a brief overview of the Blender interface. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be doing a very quick introduction on the basics of Blender. So if you are already a little bit familiar with Blender, this is probably largely going to be review. Now, for this course, I am only going to show you what is essential for completing this project. I think it is a better, more efficient way to learn tools such as this. However, if you want a slower, more in-depth look at modeling in Blender, please go take my Blender Basics course, which is part of the Blender Mega course, available wherever you are watching this video. So in the last video, we talked about the startup and the splash screens. So in this video, I'm going to just start from a new general Blender file. So whenever you create a new Blender file using the general template, it is going to look like this. Now we have here in the main portion of the window is composed of what is called our 3D viewport. Now the 3D viewport is somewhat analogous to our level in Unreal Engine in that it is showing everything that is currently in our scene. So all new Blender scenes will start with a default cube, a camera, and a light object. Up here in the top right corner of the screen, we have our outliner, and this is analogous to the outliner in Unreal Engine in that it has a list of all of the objects in our scene as well as any folders, which in Blender are called collections, that they are contained within. Now, clicking on an object in the outliner will highlight it in the 3D viewport and vice versa, just the same as Unreal Engine. Down here, we have what is called the Properties tab. This is analogous to the Details panel in Unreal Engine 5 in that anything that you have selected in the 3D viewport or the outliner here is properties, its details will be shown here. So you can see that when I have the cube selected here, we have the name of it right here, but when I have the camera selected, this information changes to be relevant to the camera. The last bit of the main window we have here is the animation timeline. Now this is just a playback timeline. If we had any animation in our scene, we could view it by pressing play on the timeline here. Any keyframes we have would be shown right here, and so on. We are not going to be animating for this part of the course, so we're just gonna sort of drop it down here. Now, I want to talk a little bit about navigation in Blender. As I mentioned before, navigation in Blender is based largely on using the mouse wheel button. So to rotate around your selection, all you have to do is click down on the mouse wheel button and drag your mouse around to rotate. To pan your view without changing the angle, hold Shift on your keyboard, click with your middle mouse button, and drag your mouse. To zoom in on your selection, simply scroll the mouse wheel. Or additionally, if you don't have a mouse wheel, you can hold Control and use the middle mouse button and drag in and out to zoom in and out on your selection. Now, all of these operations can also be done by clicking the appropriate icon over here. So we have our zoom. If I click and drag on that icon itself, we get a zoom. If I click and drag on the hand, we can pan around. And I suppose there is no rotate function there. We just have to use the middle mouse button to rotate. So just like in Unreal Engine 5, sometimes we need to view our scenes or our objects from an orthographic view. And if you recall from our early lessons on prototyping, orthographic views are simply looking at our scenes either directly from the front, the side, or the top without any form of perspective. So in Blender, we can easily achieve this by using the keyboard. Again, if you have a numpad, these functions will be bound to your numpad numbers, not your top row numbers. However, I am emulating the numpad here, so I am just using the row of numbers at the top of my keyboard. So to view your scene from the front orthographic view, simply press 1. To view it from the right, we will press 3. And to view it from the top, we will press 7. Now, you'll notice here that when I am viewing my cube here normally, up at the top left corner, it says user perspective. This means that we are viewing our object with perspective applied to it, meaning it is not orthographic. But when I press 1 to view it from the front, this information right here changes to say front orthographic, right orthographic when I press 3, and top orthographic when I press 7. Now, rotating out of an orthographic view by using the middle mouse button will automatically return you to the perspective view. Now, if you wanted to manually switch between orthographic and perspective, you could do so by pressing 5 on the keyboard. So now I am viewing my cube from an angle, but I am not using any sort of perspective here, and I get more of an isometric viewpoint. Again, that was pressing 5 to get a orthographic view, and press 5 again to get it back into perspective. Now we will really only be viewing things in perspective unless we are in one of these top, side, or front views. But just so you know, maybe you're working on an isometric game or something of that nature, pressing 5 on your keyboard or clicking this icon right here will let you manually hop between perspective and orthographic views. Now, you can also view things directly from the back, the left, or the bottom of the scene, but the shortcut keys for this are a little bit different. So to view something from the back, I would hold Control and 1. So the way I like to think of this is that the back, left, and bottom views are the opposite of the front, right, or top views. So to get to the opposite of whatever view you want, you just need to hold Control plus the number. So if the front view is 1 on the keyboard, the back view is Control 1. And if the right side is 3 on your keyboard, the left side is Control 3. So it's a little bit counterintuitive maybe to begin with, but you do get used to these shortcuts. Additionally, if you wanted to snap to a specific viewpoint, you could do so using this gizmo up here. This gizmo will orient based on your camera direction, so you can see it move around as I move the camera around. But if I wanted to snap to any of these views, all I would have to do is to select the view here on the gizmo and click on it. So clicking on the X will give me the right orthographic. Clicking on the Y will give me the back. Clicking on -Z will give me the bottom, for example. Let's talk about how to save and load our Blender files. So let's say I have this file here and I want to save it. All we have to do to save a Blender file is come up to File and either Save or Save As. You'll want to choose a location on your machine where you want to save it. I'm going to put it in this folder here. Let's call it Test Save and click Save. That's pretty straightforward. However, I do want to talk a little bit about file types here. So here's my test save here. This is the area on my computer where I have saved it. Now you'll notice that it saves as a .blend file. Only Blender can open a .blend file. So in order to get our creations from Blender to Unreal Engine 5, we will have to export our individual objects within our Blender file into a different file format. But we're going to cover that when we're ready to do so. But for now, just know that .blend can only be opened by Blender, and you cannot bring a .blend file into Unreal Engine itself. So loading is just as straightforward as saving. You can either just double click on your .blend file and it will open in Blender. As long as everything was installed correctly, it should just automatically know and open it with the most recent version of Blender that you have installed on your machine. Alternatively, you could always open Blender first, come into File, Open, and open it that way. Okay, so we're going to take a little break here, and when we come back, I'm going to cover a little bit of theory on 3D basics, as well as some more of the basic functionality of Blender itself. Okay, so before we delve any deeper into the basics of Blender, I just wanted to do a really quick overview on some of the concepts that apply to 3D graphics. For those of you who have maybe never worked with 3D graphics or just want to understand it on a little deeper of a level. Now, everything that we've been doing in Unreal and Blender up to this point has all been in 3D. And so far, it has been largely pretty intuitive, and that is because we perceive reality in 3 dimensions. Now, what this means is that every point in the universe can be mathematically described using a 3-point system, which we denote with X, Y, and Z values. Now, this should be somewhat familiar to you from the work we have done already in Unreal using things like the X, the Y, and the Z values for location and rotation. And in Blender, it is no different. So here we have our default cube, for instance, and it starts at a location of 0, 0, 0, a rotation of 0, 0, 0, and a scale of 1 in all directions. Now in Blender, the X axis is represented by this red line here, and it basically describes the left and right movement of any object in our scene. The Y is denoted by the green axis here, and it represents forward and backward in our scene. And the Z axis is the up and down axis, and it is represented by this blue line in our scene. Now, these colors are the exact same as they are in Unreal, so this should be, again, somewhat familiar. Now, there's one small caveat here in that some 3D programs represent the Z as being forward and the Y as being up. And in those cases, you just have to know the orientation of the program that you're, eventually going to be using this object for, and you may have to rotate your objects by 90 degrees to get them to appear correctly in those programs. However, Blender has the same orientation as Unreal, so we are all set and ready to go there. Now, 3D computer graphics are representations of 3D objects that are drawn or rendered onto a 2D screen. The screen, of course, being your computer monitor. So what a 3D rendering software such as Blender or Unreal Engine, what these do is that they take the mathematical information that describes each of these 3D objects and they render them onto this 2D surface using the principles of perspective so that our brains still perceive them as being 3-dimensional. That is why when we view 3D objects in the 3D viewport, we are viewing them in perspective. Now, all the objects we create in Blender for this project are going to be known as mesh objects. A mesh object at its most basic level is a collection of points in 3D space as described by their X, Y, and Z values. Now, these points are called vertices. The 3D rendering package you are using, in this case Blender, will take information on these individual points here, and it will draw edges between them to further define the shape. Now, the combination of vertices and edges that make up your mesh are what is known as a wireframe, which we can view like this. So from this point, faces, or sometimes they are called polygons, will be drawn in between these edges to give the object its solid appearance. Therefore, a mesh object is simply a digital representation of a three-dimensional object that is composed of vertices, edges, and faces. But this will make more sense as we start to work with the objects themselves. Okay, so when you start up Blender, you will be in what is called object mode. And object mode basically is the level of Blender which allows us to work with individual objects on a whole object level. So when I have this cube here selected and I move it, I am moving the entire cube. Now, to add a new object into Blender, all we have to do is press Shift and A to bring up this add menu. Now don't worry about anything down here for now. All we want to focus on at this point is adding new meshes. So we have a cube to start with, but we can add all sorts of shapes here, which is a plane, a sphere, a cone, and so on, all the basic 3D shapes that you could require. So if I were to add a cone to this scene, it's going to add it at the world origin, which is 0, 0, 0, where all these axes collide. And you can see that when I select it, it is a separate and distinct object from this default cube here. Now, if I need to delete any objects from the scene, I can simply select it here, or in the hierarchy. You can see that my cone has been added to the hierarchy as well. I can select any object from my scene that I do not wish to have and simply press the delete key to get rid of it. Alternatively, you can also select any object in your scene and press the X key to pull up the delete menu, and that will delete it as well. Now, I want to talk about how to transform objects in the viewport. Now, we've transformed objects in Unreal Engine before, so the concept should be familiar. Transforming, just as a reminder, is a succinct way of describing the values of location, rotation, and scale for any object in your scene. So, changing any of these values is called transforming the object. Now, in Unreal Engine 5, the transform hotkeys are based on their location on the keyboard. So we had W for move, we had E for rotate, and R for scale, because those keys are all right next to each other on a typical QWERTY keyboard. However, things are going to work a little bit differently in Blender. The transform hotkeys in Blender are based on the name of the operation. So to move something in Blender, we're going to press the G key for grab. And if we press the G key and move our mouse around, we can see it moving sort of uniformly across 3D space. To drop or cancel this movement, we just want to hit escape, or right click will also cancel the operation. To place anything in a new location, we just want to press D for grab, move it to where we want it, and then left click to drop it. To rotate an object in Blender, we're going to use the R key for rotate. So if we hit R and we move our mouse, we can see it rotating on all axes here. And similarly, if we wanted to scale any object in Blender, we would select it and hit S for scale. So one more time, those hotkeys are G for grab, R for rotate, S for scale. Of course, we can always undo all of these operations by pressing Control and Z. Now, transforms can be performed in a number of different ways. We can perform a transform operation uniformly, meaning across all three axes at once. So if we were to select this cube and press S, if we look right here, as we perform the operation, we can see that we are scaling this cube uniformly across all directions. They can also be performed non-uniformly by following the transform hotkey with the key of the axis you wish to transform along. So for example, pressing S on your keyboard and then X will scale the mesh along the X axis. Or for another example, pressing G for grab and Z will transform it. We'll grab this mesh and move it along just the Z axis here. The last way we can perform any transform operations is numerically. What this means is that we are going to follow the transform and or axis keys with the numerical value. So for example, if I select this cube and press R, then Z, then type 45, I can rotate this cube around the Z axis by 45 degrees. Or something like G and then Y and let's say -10, we'll move it -10 units forward along the Y axis here. Of course, all of these numerical values are in reference to world space, which is denoted by this grid here. And the rotation values are in degrees, meaning that 360 as a numerical value would be equivalent to 0. So there's no rotation between 360 and 0. You can also type in these values manually here under the transform panel, which is in the properties window, and it's the object properties tab within that window. I'm going to clear the transforms I've made. And the way that I do this, let's say I have something transformed and I want to just get it back at the default. I'm going to use the Alt key plus the transform hotkey to clear this value. So if you look at these values here, let's say the location, if I wanted to clear the location of this object, I would select it in the viewport and press Alt and G, and that would snap all these values back to 0. And this works with any of these. So I would press Alt and R to clear the rotation and Alt and S to clear the scale. So that is the basics of transforming in object mode. However, transforming primitives around is not going to be sufficient for what we want to create in Blender. So we can change the shape of these objects in more advanced ways, as well as add and remove points by pressing the Tab key to enter edit mode. You could also access edit in object mode via this drop down on the top left corner of the screen. We could just select this drop down and we have object mode and we have edit mode. Now we have some other modes here that we're going to get to later, but for now, let's just look at object and edit mode. So pressing Tab will toggle in and out of object and edit mode. So let's go to edit mode. And from edit mode, from here, we can see we can select individual vertices by having the vertex selection mode active, which is denoted by this icon right here, this dot. We can select our vertices. If we change to edge select mode, which is this icon right here, we can select any edges. And if we change to face select mode, we can select faces here. Now, of course, all of these selections and Now, of course, selecting all of these, we can still use our standard transform tool. So if I wanted to grab this point and move it down, I could select it in edit mode, press G and then Z, and grab just this point down. And already you see I have a more complex shape than I was able to get in object mode. Of course, we can select more than one point at a time by holding the Shift key. So making our first selection, holding the Shift key, making a second one. And now I can use any of the transform operations that we discussed to change this edge however you like. So if I were to say scale it along the Z, I could bring it in like so. To select everything within a single object, all we have to do is press A on our keyboard for all. To deselect everything, we just have to click somewhere off of our object. So let's say we wanted to continue to refine this shape by adding some more points to it. This has already become a more complex shape than we had previously, but in order to further develop it, we're going to need some more vertices here in order to refine the shape more. So there's a couple ways, there's a couple of basic ways to add more points to our mesh. Now, the first one is going to be to subdivide. The way that we can subdivide is by making a selection on our mesh. I'm going to select this entire face. We can right click, and then the first menu option here is subdivide. So what we get here, if we go back into vertex select mode, is we can see that it has divided this face evenly into 4 smaller faces, and that is how we subdivide. We can also subdivide edges by selecting the edge, either through using the edge select mode or by shift selecting both points that make up the edge. And we can right click and hit subdivide again to put a single point on that edge, which we then can manipulate. Another very common way to add points to a mesh is to use the insert edge loop function. Now to do this, we're going to hit Control and R on the keyboard, which will give us this little preview yellow ring that goes around your mesh in different directions depending on where you place your cursor. So let's say I wanted to basically add an edge loop around my mesh horizontally. Well, I would place my cursor here, I would click, and then from here I have sort of this slide functionality. So now I can either slide it to where I want it and click to place it, or if I wanted to divide this exactly in half, what I could do is hit Control R to bring up that preview again, click, and click again without moving the mouse at all. We'll place it exactly in the middle. Or if you Control R, click, and then right click, let's say you've you wanted it directly in the middle, but you've accidentally moved your mouse and you don't know how to get it back exactly, well, you could just right click and it will drop that cut directly in the middle. Now, there are lots of more ways to add points, but we will cover them more later. Those are the most basic ways. To delete a point, all we have to do is select the point that we wish to delete and press the delete key, or we could press the X key, and either of these options will bring up the same delete menu. From here, you need to select how you would like to delete what you're selected. So we have 2 options here. We have the delete functions right here, and we have the dissolve functions right here. So if I were to select a single vertex, press X to bring up my delete menu and delete any vertices I have selected, this will remove the point and anything that is dependent on that point as well. So because I deleted that individual vertex, everything, every face and edge that was dependent on that vertex being there is now deleted as well, and I have a sort of hole in my mesh. Let's Control Z to undo that. The second way we can delete something is by using the dissolve functionality. So if I press X and I try to dissolve this vertex, what you'll see we've gotten here is that it has removed the selected point, but it has tried to retain the underlying geometry. So the point is gone, but you'll see there is no longer a hole in the mesh, and it has instead tried to draw this face over the remaining vertices. Now, as I said, there are more advanced mesh modeling functions, but we will cover them as they are used for this project. I just wanted to give you sort of an overview of the basics on how we manipulate mesh objects.